The war in Syria continues. Israel destroys Syria's naval assets and creates a buffer zone for its buffer zone. Iran finds one of its critical supply routes cut off. Russia scrambles to figure out what to do with its military assets in Syria. Regimes all over Africa are feeling just a little less comfortable. The popcorn continues to pop in Georgia, and Ukraine hopes that this is a sign of things to come. The world just keeps getting busier, doesn't it? December 8th may have been a sad day for Assad, but the rest of the world has been busy in the week afterward. Like it or not, we now live in a period of globalized conflict, and the fall of Assad's regime has all sorts of domino effects on the rest of the world. That is why, today, we are going to look at what is currently cooking in the wake of an incredibly disruptive event. We will begin with what is happening in Syria, because the fall of a regime does not necessarily mean the end of a civil war. Then we will stay in the region to examine how much of a setback it imposes on Iran, followed by a pivot westward to see the two power plays that Israel has embarked on. After that, it is the major strategic problems that Russia will have to tackle to keep its global operations running. And then we will conclude with what is in store for Ukraine. But we begin with the potential continuation of the civil war. Syria is not a simple case of two parties, a north and a south, for example, fighting until one side called it quits. Instead, the situation on the ground looked something like this at the start of the offensive. Assad's government controlled the regions between these flags. The Syrian Salvation Government, the entity responsible for the initial thrust, and better known by its military arms initialism HTS, controlled only this small area. The Turkey-backed Syrian National Army had a couple of pockets in the north. Kurdish forces held large portions in the northeast. And the Syrian Free Army, backed by a US presence, stayed in a deconfliction zone toward the south. Oh, and there were fragments of Islamic State hanging around in the desert. That is why the United States got there in the first place. Now, when HTS went on the offensive and encountered little resistance from Assad's government, the other groups recognized the window of opportunity in front of them. As such, the Kurds pushed southwest, and the Syrian Free Army drove west toward Damascus. But it was a third group, the Southern Operations Room, that came from the north. Even Islamic State got more active. The whole thing became reminiscent of World War II, and the race between Western allies and the Soviet Union to reach Berlin. Back in Syria, though, now the question turns to whether the groups can coexist. Well, can most of the groups coexist? They all hate Islamic State. Previously, they worked hand in hand to oust a common enemy in Assad. But now that bond is gone. Moreover, they must work together at a time when a whole bunch of other countries are thinking about the fallout, some of whom are receiving more attention than the others. For example, coverage of Israel's ground operations in the Golan Heights received massive attention. The destruction of Syria's naval fleet, not so much. Same with how Iran is working to handle the crisis arising from the offensive. Interestingly, these had more focus coming from right-leaning sources. That stands in contrast to how discussion of Russia's strategy to handle its bases in Syria had balanced but little coverage overall, and the completely fragmented discussion of the consequences of all of this for Ukraine. How do I know all of this? Well, it only took a few quick clicks via the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Ground News is the ultimate news aggregator, searching for articles from outlets worldwide and placing them in a single feed. It is the perfect tool for a time as chaotic as right now. Plus, it allows you to compare the headlining practices of those news outlets. And for a limited time, my viewers get 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, exclusively through my link, ground.news/linesonmaps. So head over to that link or scan the QR code to better inform yourself and support this channel. Okay, again, the pre-offensive map looked like this, but now the map looks something like this, though you should not trust any map you see because the fog of war here remains thick. Nevertheless, it shows some potential fractures. For example, Turkey is really uneasy about the Kurds establishing a de facto independent Kurdistan, given the tumultuous history that Turkey has with ethnic Kurds on its side of the border. That is a big part of why Turkey sponsors the Syrian National Army. On the other side, you have US-supported moderates going up against HTS, with the leader of HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, being the former leader of Syria's al-Qaeda branch. And in case you were wondering, that is the literal mugshot that the United States took of al-Jawlani when he was captured. Moreover, his imprisonment was not just anywhere. This is a man who spent time in Abu Ghraib. If you know, you know. If you don't, well, don't read the Wikipedia page if you were looking to have a nice day. Heck, normally we just look at dog videos when we get to the unhappy parts, but Abu Ghraib ruined even that. Instead, we are watching Barksdale Air Force Base, ironically named here, finding a creative solution to its rodent problem. Anyway, al-Jawlani has moderated his position over the years, and now promises to end hostilities with the West and protect minority rights within Syria. Friendly reminder to not listen to what leaders say, but rather watch what they do. However, for the time being, his actions seem to match his rhetoric. Unfortunately, one thing that Syria does not have going for it is something known as the conflict trap. We talk about this all the time, but the basic idea is that war is development in reverse. Effort goes into destroying infrastructure rather than building it. We could spend all day looking at the photos from Syria if we were not sure about that. And it is no surprise. The problem is especially acute in civil wars, where all of the combat occurs within one country's territory. That makes economic opportunities in the country few and far between, both during and immediately after the war, which in turn facilitates recruitments of soldiers, which in turn facilitates a restart to the war. And that destroys more economic opportunities, allowing the cycle to go round and round and round. Breaking out of that cycle usually requires an influx of external aid, but that presupposes that the sides can get along for enough time to stop fighting and start building bricks. And to be clear, they are still jockeying over land. At least the European Union has a strong incentive to pay the price here. Its countries have been long frustrated with migrant flows coming from Syria. Well, if you want them to stop, and want some of them to return home, there needs to be some level of safety back in their country. Money goes a long way to solve that problem, though they may need to modify some lists first. And that does it for the internal politics of Syria. Thus, we can pivot to all of the external consequences of the fall of Assad, and there are a bunch of interesting things to report on that front. Let's begin by diving into Iran's situation, and suffice it to say that the past 14 months have been bad for Tehran. The primary modern geopolitical strategy for Iran has been to establish an axis of resistance to fight back against Israeli influence in the region. Among its members were Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi rebels in Yemen, and, yes, Syria. Well, let's go back to October 7th, 2023. That marked the beginning of the war in Gaza. In the 14 months afterward, Israel has systematically destroyed Hamas. Meantime, Hezbollah thought it would be a good idea to open up a second front while Israel was busy in Gaza. But Israel much more efficiently dismantled the leadership and ranks of the organization. I will never look at a pager the same way again. This also facilitated the rebel offensive in Syria. In the past, if rebels threatened Damascus, Hezbollah would have streamed across the border from Lebanon to quash the attack. But months ago, Israel eliminated that possibility, and thus in came the rebels. Consequently, Iran is facing a ratchet effect. Previously, Iran supplied Hezbollah via land routes through Iraq and then Syria. But going this way is no longer an option. A weakened Hezbollah has somehow become even more enfeebled. Does that mean that Iran and everyone else is about to witness the end of Hezbollah? No. Resistance is an idea that will not die easily. Even if it is not Hezbollah in name, another group will arise to fill the ideological vacuum. Actually, that is how the Iranian-sponsored Houthis have come into prominence, using the war in Gaza as their rallying call. And that is also the only real bright spot for Iran over this period, as the American-led Operation Prosperity Guardian has still failed to return traffic around the Bab el-Mandab Strait to normal levels. Moving on, let's stay in the region and turn to Israel, which has been involved in two major operations. The first is along the Golan Heights, emphasis on heights for reasons that will become clear in a moment. It sits towards Israel's northwest. Israel seized about 2/3 of the region during the Six-Day War way back in 1967, but the international community still recognizes it as Syrian territory. The obvious upshot for Israel is that taking the heights adds land to the country, plus that land also holds a fair amount of water. But the main benefit of possessing the Golan is the heights part, because, as everyone from Mustafar to Damascus knows, having the high ground is key to military victory, here as a consequence of helping propel artillery a greater distance, as well as being a better lookout point. It therefore acts as a buffer zone to the rest of Israel. Well, I heard Israel likes buffer zones, because they appear to be creating a buffer zone for their buffer zone, so they can buffer zone while they buffer zone. In meme-free language, that means that Israel is pushing eastward from its existing positions, minimally. How far Israel intends to go with this remains unclear, though. Up a bit north, Israel's other major move was to sink Syria's naval fleet. Combined together, what we are seeing is reminiscent of Russia's response to the Ukrainian Maidan Revolution back in 2014, when the Kremlin annexed Crimea and seized Ukrainian naval assets. Basically, both looked to find a way to convert temporary civil chaos into some long-term gains. Today, this process is undoubtedly upsetting the Syrians who will take part in an interim government, but they lack the capacity for an organized response at the moment. The nuance that Israel's targets were technically Assad's assets probably does not fly for what is supposed to be the new head of the Syrian state. Speaking of Russia, one side note here. In the recent past, Israel has played nice with Moscow, in part because of trying to balance escalation concerns in the Syrian civil war. This has resulted in a rather tepid coordination between Ukraine and Israel, despite the parties' simultaneous involvement in two separate wars, both underwritten by a common major power patron. But with Assad gone, some of that incentive is off the table, so we will see if the policy changes accordingly. You know what? We might as well stick with Russia and the fallout that the Kremlin is having to deal with. The starting point is along Syria's Mediterranean coast, where the Tartus Naval Facility and Hamaim Air Base are. During the Syrian civil war, the Kremlin essentially intervened on behalf of the Syrian government, especially by engaging in air campaigns, so that the Russian armed forces could use Syria as a logistical hub. But to understand their broader relevance, we must turn to Africa. The Africa Corps provides regime security to a bunch of countries there: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Equatorial Guinea, Libya, and the Central African Republic. Successful operations in those countries require consistent resupply. That would be a task for the Aleutian IL-76 airlifter, which usually takes a pit stop in Syria before heading to Africa. The good news for Russia is that the IL-76 has the range to go nonstop all the way from Russia to Africa. The bad news is that it cannot go most of those places while holding cargo, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the enterprise. With that in mind, Libya would be a sensible alternative site if Syria is no longer an option. It is a close enough middle point to still act as a logistical hub, and there are enough friendly elements there to spare some coastline and flat inland ground. The problem with Libya is that getting bases to the same level as Syria's will take years, at a time when Russian resources are otherwise being funneled northeast of there. Meanwhile, Libya is not exactly a portrait of stability, creating a potential situation where Russia invests untold rubles only for the situation on the ground to become untenable. So, is it possible to go elsewhere? Yes. Is it a good idea, though? Maybe not. Meanwhile, a naval base ought to be a lower priority. There is a certain irony in Putin, a leader who looks to Peter the Great's accomplishments aspirationally, losing a warm water port. But a naval presence in the Mediterranean is a luxury good, and the task in Ukraine ranks as the greater priority. Now, it remains possible that Russia will find a solution to keep the bases in Syria. And indeed, there are reports of negotiations between the parties to that effect. But the problems here are manifold. Whom exactly among the rebel groups will have the final say about the bases? Will those groups even be the least bit amenable to hosting Russian troops after they held up Assad for so long? Will they engage in any serious conversations at all while Assad safely resides in Moscow? Will Russia, a country that knows full well that agreements are not worth the paper that they are written on, anticipate that Syria will follow through, rather than push Russia out by force once the collective rebels are organized? And supposing that the Syrian government is on board, will Russia want to pull back anyway, out of fear that random militant groups will attack them? This is probably why the available evidence indicates that Russia is packing up, and any negotiations between Moscow and the rebels are just about guaranteeing a peaceful withdrawal. Whatever happens with the bases, Russia has a deeper problem. There is a reputational effect that Assad's fall has on rebel and opposition group expectations on whether Russia will intervene. That applies to all of those African countries, but also Georgia and the ongoing election protests there, and in a worst-case scenario for Russia, Transnistria and Belarus. For the more proximate problems in Africa, the normal solution to the problem is to make substantial deployments to the regions, both as a credible signal of willingness to intervene, and also to act as a tripwire. But that would mean that the protected regimes would need to pay Moscow a higher price, and it presupposes that Russia has any troops to spare, even at a premium price. That possibility may seem implausible on the surface, but you can imagine a scenario where Moscow is willing to take that money, turn around and buy even more North Korean manpower, and then hope to eke out a slight power profit in the process. Last on the list is Ukraine, and the theme here is going to be caution. It is easy to look at the situation, note that Russia is Ukraine's enemy, and that something bad happened to Russia, and thus this must be good for Ukraine. But not so fast. The whole reason that Russia left Assad exposed was to shore up its military strength on the Ukrainian front. It is a classic trade-off between signaling a general lack of commitment and picking your battles, and it is one that the United States is intimately familiar with due to its time in Afghanistan. There, discussion remains that the American withdrawal signaled that Washington lacked resolve, which in turn encouraged Putin to try his luck in Ukraine. The flip side is that the departure from Afghanistan meant that there was one fewer military responsibility on the Department of Defense's plate, which in turn allowed the DoD to focus on that situation. And it is worth emphasizing the consequences of Washington's focus. There is all sorts of consternation in the United States that Americans are not seeing a return on their investment in Ukraine. Indeed, Russia is still advancing, and its pace has only increased over the last half of a year. But without US aid, Russia does not face the resistance that it has. The Kremlin never encounters the manpower problems that it continues to suffer from, and business as usual continues in Syria. Something that Obama oversaw the beginning of, and Trump inherited but failed to make progress on, was eventually solved by the Biden administration, even as that administration was on the verge of abandoning hope. Yikes. But that success was a direct consequence of funding the Ukraine war. Put bluntly, the fall of Assad does not happen without support for Ukraine. In fact, It is such a result that gives Ukraine hope that the Trump administration could be persuaded to increase aid rather than cut it. For its part, Ukraine seems to think that this type of effect is what dominates. To wit, Ukrainian special forces appear to have gone into Syria to teach rebels how to optimize their use of drones, and drones were a big part of the lightning offensive at the end of November. It is dominoes indeed, all the way down. And, in sum, it is a busy time for everyone. Well, that is all I have on all sorts of countries. If you want to learn more about what is happening, check out this Q&A video about Syria on my secondary channel. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.